Dear all, welcome to another exciting episode of PhD PDF Scholarship Podcast. Today, we are privileged to have Dr. Andrew Akbashev, a renowned scientist and a speaker in academia, who has captivated his PhD community with his insights, including his active presence on LinkedIn. Dr. Akbashev's impressive journey encompasses roles at Paul Scherrer Institute and Stanford University, and he holds a PhD in material science and engineering from Drexel University. In this episode, we will explore the essentials of research writing and publishing for empowering the research aspirants on their academic journey. So, welcome, Dr. Andrew, to our podcast. And our listeners would be interested to know more about you and maybe your research in very simple language before even we start our discussion topics. Over to
Sure.
you, Andrew.
Thank you so much for inviting me. So going over my research backgrounds, I work in, like you said, already in material science. And when I worked at Stanford, I was a material scientist. And even today, I'm somewhat material scientist, even though I'm trying to go away a little bit from these cliches of like material scientist, chemist, or physicist. The science is not really, doesn't care if you're a physicist or a chemist, it doesn't matter in the end of the day. So what we work on mostly now these days is related to the field of electrochemistry and the field of sustainable fuels, production of hydrogen. How do you ensure that the reactions that are leading to production of hydrogen are going the way that you wish to go them? And we don't really go into the process engineering or the engineering side of those things, but more like into the fundamentals. We're trying to understand why some reactions go this way and not the other way, why some materials work better than others, and how we can change those materials in a predictable manner. There are lots of things that I go into. So mostly I work with microscopy, a lot of X-ray spectroscopy. For those who are maybe a little bit in my field, that would be epitaxy and oxide communities. There's a lot of things. But of course, I also do spend some time on the outreach and the discussion with the overall academic community about how science probably should be better done, in which way we can perhaps improve the current situation with academia. Because a lot of people are talking about a crisis, and it's indeed there. And of course, I do try to help the students a lot who get into different situations, and I'm trying to voice out the difficulties that a lot of students are facing, but at the same time, they cannot talk about it, unfortunately. There are a lot of barriers to communicating your challenges when you're a student. So I'm trying to sort of help on that side too, and I think that through this, perhaps there's a little bit of a change in the community that we're seeing. Not only, of course, for me, there's a lot of people who do very similar things. So that would be sort of in a nutshell who I am.
Thank you, Andrew. Definitely, as you mentioned, people, research aspirants are looking forward for perspectives of people who have gained research experience through different universities and working in different areas. So I think now we are good enough to start for the first question.
Yeah. So to start off the podcast, if you are a master's student or a PhD, no matter what, so the first question is writing the first paper, like whether it is technical paper, their first work, it is always important because everybody will be struggling to get a start. So in that hunt for getting the first review or first technical paper, what would be the various steps or strategies they can think of to make a comprehensive literature survey? Because with that only they can find or narrow down the novelty or the objective. So based on your experience and in dealing with all the masters and PhD students, so what are the effective strategies should be?
okay, so that's related to writing of manuscripts. So I think it, first of all, it depends a lot on the field, like I already mentioned before, that there are fields where you write in a specific style, in a specific way. There are fields that are overflown with literature, where no way can you really track all the papers, even from some of the most impactful groups around the world. It's just too many. So in general, I think a lot comes down to so if you are to write a paper, it means that you've already done quite a bit of research that you want to discuss, right? Your study is more or less completed, and now you want to write about it. It means that you've already spent quite a bit of time on that. So now a lot depends on what you've been doing during that period, like what your advisor was advising you on, what contributions other people made. And so often, at least in my experience, or the way we do it, I work with my students, is that we start early on discussing literature, discussing the background. I don't like the word literature because sometimes it's not about the literature, it's about the background itself. Because literature is a bit ill-defined, so there's just too many papers. Like, you can't just keep reading everything. There's no need for this. You need to understand the questions that you're trying to answer, and then starting from those questions, you want to start digging a little bit into the background. So what people really already know, which groups really work on those problems. And then if you do it at the beginning, then you can, of course, keep an eye on the papers, on those groups, so what they publish, what kind of new things come out. You go to conferences, you attend talks within your probably a bit broader area of your questions that you're trying to answer. And that way you can also learn about the things that have not been published yet, but they are already presented. So you can keep yourself up to date on what is happening in the field without really getting first to the end of your study. So ideally you want to do it as you go. And so by the time you're ready to publish, you already know what you're going to cite, what kind of literature survey you want to do. And then all you have to do then eventually is to write it down, maybe coming up with, first of all, of course, with the structure of your manuscript. So normally literature, actually, introduction of the literature review, as you call it, comes probably the last one of the last steps in writing the manuscript. Because at first, you want to make sure your manuscript is structured well, so you know which questions will be answered in which sections of the manuscript. Then you provide those answers, you write them down, and then you try to see, okay, to what literature can that be related to? And often that way, it's easier to write it rather than starting from sort of, from top to bottom, like starting from introduction, then whatever methods, depending on which field you work with, then you describe the experimental part, then discussions, results, whatever, conclusions. So that structure is good for reading, but that's not good for writing. That way, I normally recommend leaving the literature survey to the end when you're writing the manuscript. However, but for your own understanding of the field, you want to keep doing it as you go in your studies. Because often you may end up with, there could be some stuff published that can give you a different outlook on your own study, right, that you're doing right now before you even publish it. So you can change and you can reshape your study as you keep reading new and new results from others. Again, if that's your field that is quickly developing. There are fields which have very few people working on them, or you may even wander sort of in a direction where no one's working, and that's usually becomes a problem. Then, okay, which literature actually can I even find? Like, is there any connections? And then you have to be a bit of an investigator. You keep searching until you find some connections, but then you need to understand the general scientific sort of umbrella around your topics. So where is it connected to? So there are a lot of things that you can go through in terms of literature writing, but I suggest given the extent of literature these days, it was very different when I started, extremely different. These days, there's just too many sources. Make sure you start from scratch. Like when you start your project, that's when you start reading papers, and you find the best ones, the milestone studies, sort of the most impactful, the most relevant to your study. Save them, because that's what will shape your literature survey when you start writing your manuscript, maybe within a few years from the time you started your PhD. So that's probably the best I can say in a general sense. But then it all depends a lot on a particular case. So really strongly. And my also very strong advice is to talk to your advisor. I see a lot of PhD students who simply somehow ignore that part. They think that they have to write it on their own completely. But our experience shows that yes, you can learn perhaps a bit more if you make those mistakes, but those mistakes can cost you time. And time means you may miss certain opportunities in the future along your career. So you want to try to balance your independence in terms of how much time you put yourself into your own efforts and how much help you get from your advisor.
Yeah, I do have a follow-up question. Like, apart from the conferences, apart from the journal articles, or going to conference and interacting, do you see that the students going to all these funding websites and seeing what are the latest projects that were granted? Let's say there is a project that is granted in the area of water treatment, and if they look the last 5 years, what are the projects that are granted? Is that an easier way to identify challenges easily than going through the literatures?
Challenges, you mean for just to start a project, or challenges for the manuscript?
Just to start a project, like to get an overall idea about.
Okay, so this is a very different question then. How do you start a project? So yes, you can, but then there is a caveat. If you have already a project that has been posted online and that says, okay, this is the type of research that group is doing, most often you don't get the details, right? You just get an abstract at best. And the problem is then, at least for me, and that's the way I normally mentor people about this, is that if you see it, don't go there. It's just an indicator that this field is only being covered right now. So unless you have a very peculiar way to solve a problem and you think that group may be unable to do it in time, then you can try to go for that project or similar research direction, something like using it as a navigator for yourself. But I would not do it myself, because in most cases, if there is a project that is ongoing, most likely you will be just following that project. You will not be the one who will be able to make the first contribution in that particular niche field or whatever, in that sort of question that you're trying to solve. So you're already following. And in some way, if you want to, it depends on really what you want to do next. So if you want to go to industry, perhaps it doesn't matter. But if you want to stay in academia, you want to make sure that your studies are among the first ones in one way or another, because you have to present it in a way that conveys uniqueness of your approach, of your vision, of your understanding, and so on. So, but if you're already following someone's work, that might be tricky. So yes, you can, but then you need to find a very different angle that if they publish already now, like what they're working on, will you still be able to stay unique in terms of your research and your contribution and how people will see you? Not only how you see yourself, but how those from like the people who are in the project that you don't know much about, or the people at conferences, will they say, okay, you are actually the person to follow from today when they see your talks? Because I go to conferences a lot. So, for example, if I see a talk that is just very similar to many other things that I often see, I'm not really inclined to follow that person in terms of research. But if I see a talk that ignites my imagination, that makes me feel like, oh, there's something I've been missing, something that I wish I could come up myself with, then it's an indicator that that person has a unique vision. And most often, I can sign up for Google Scholar updates for those people, because it's just like, okay, it looks like there's something unique I can learn. So we often want to follow that line of thought when we work in science. And so this is where I would be careful, but it depends a lot on, again, what your goals are for your career. Also, one thing that one has, of course, to keep in mind is that if there are a number of projects within a certain direction, it means that those projects, they highlight sort of the importance of that direction and how much money there are. So you can try to follow it, but again, you want to stay away from the specifics of the existing projects. You can say, for example, okay, water treatment, fine, there are 5 or 10 projects in water treatment accepted this year. Perhaps that field is getting expanded, so there will be some interest in the future from industry, from academia, fine. Or maybe there is currently some interest. Then let me follow that theme, but let me come up with my own vision for what should be done to treat it properly.
Thank you. So
it's a very general advice, again, because it really depends on where you work, which field, because there are so many different scenarios that you can follow. But in general, yes.
Yeah. The point
Arun, the same goes actually for literature. So if you see a paper just appear even in Science or Nature, whatever journals that people love to read, that paper perhaps shows the state of the art in a certain niche direction, right? It sets a new milestone. But that means that if you follow that paper and you just do a follow-up study yourself, you will need to do way better to be, again, showing the unique. That's sort of the trick. And this is where the most challenging part is, in picking the right project.
Yeah, thank you. So, Jolish?
Okay. So moving further, based on your experience, could you please throw some light on all the elements of practices that one should focus on so as to enhance their academic writing?
How to improve your academic writing?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's a good question.
Or something.
It also. Well, first of all, if you're a student, you should know that everyone, when they're students, cannot write well. It's normal. It's totally normal, and every single best scientist in the world who we know from history could not be writing well at the beginning. It's totally normal. No one is born to be writing scientific papers. So it means that the more time you put, the more efforts you put into writing, the better you will become. So practice is number one thing, absolutely. However, there are tricks, sort of, that you can try to implement if you want. And that are the ones that I sometimes recommend my own students and the students that talk to me about these topics a lot. And those ones include, for example, especially for your first paper, find several papers in your topic, the ones that you want to cover in your topic. So those papers must be the milestone papers in the field, first. Second, they should be written in a way that if you read them, especially if you're a student, it means most likely you're not very experienced in science. You're not like reading hundreds of papers per year, most likely. And then most likely you can be easily puzzled, especially if you're just starting, by complex scientific language. That's totally normal, so for everyone. Now, find the papers which do make sense to you, because then it means the language that is used there actually is the right one, because that's the correct way to write, is to write not in a complex way, but more in a deliverable way, the way that a broader audience can understand. So more people can understand, the better. At the same time, of course, you want to stay professional within your niche field. So you want to make sure that it conveys everything that you want to say to the professional side of the audience. But at the same time, we always say that it's very easy to write a super complex manuscript, but it's super hard to write an easy to understand manuscript. And so finding those manuscripts, you find them, then what you do is, many of them actually come from Nature and Science, because these journals, they require you to write in a specific style. And here I don't want to defend those journals in terms of like, okay, this is the only way you can do it. Of course not. But if you want to make your life a bit easier, you can just start with a number of papers from Nature, Science, or other journals that are relevant to your community, perhaps. And then check the style. So how much is spent on literature review? How deep is it? Do you have to go broader? Do you start with a broader perspective and then you deep down, or you do it differently? And so keep analyzing, like break it down into parts. Check what kind of connection do you have between the literature review and results and discussions and conclusions. How much is their connection? Like that connection is something that you probably also want to make sure you have in your own manuscript, right? And so this is like how many references you put, like how relevant they are. And when you when you analyze this way, you will see it as a template. So your brain will use it as a as an input for the pattern that it should follow to write next manuscript. Doesn't mean that you have to copy paste it, absolutely not. But the general way is very similar across most manuscripts. And it doesn't matter if you go to an impact factor of 1 journal or like 50, doesn't matter at all. The key is to make sure that it's deliverable. So you can deliver your messages should be absolutely clear, and it should make sense, but it should not, of course, it should not be too simple, because that way is often, you may, so at some point you may hit, so if you keep simplifying your writing, at some point you hit the limit at which you will not be able to convey your deep science at all. So that's where you don't want to get to that, but just stay a little bit away from it, that line, and then your manuscript will be perfect. This is a general advice that I usually give people, and in most cases it works pretty well at the beginning. When you start, and then of course, then you want to make sure your advisor gives you a lot of inputs. Be ready for a lot of drafts. Some of my manuscripts go through like 20 or 30 drafts, reiterations, before we agree on the text that it really is clear. Next is give it to someone, especially outside of your lab, outside of your field, who can say, oh, like this paragraph, it just doesn't come across. I don't understand this and this and this. Make sure they can highlight things that they don't understand and give it back to you. And then you try to make them understand them. That's one of the best ways to improve the writing that you already have. So if you use the structure that you can sort of extract from the existing most impactful manuscripts, then you can, on top, if you add the feedback from others, most likely you will have 90% perfect manuscripts. Yeah, but then you keep practicing. So
yeah, thank you.
Okay, that's quite insightful advice for the aspirants. But like, I want to touch upon one topic in specific related to the review papers. So there is
wow, okay, but then it's not something you normally do as a student, right?
Yeah,
yourself. It would be very strange.
Yeah, but like it happens at 2 levels. I've seen it in academia that like there is 1 year dedicated for literature review, wherein like as a person like who's new to that field, you have to go through a lot of papers, and by the end of that 1 year, sometimes the supervisor will suggest, yeah, now you have gone through 50 or 60 papers. Now you are in a position to review that paper in terms of like putting everything, consolidating everything, and generating a new paper out of it. So that is at times considered as a trick for increasing the citations as well, because the more the number of papers you consolidate and then write it as a review paper, that's one way that is practiced. So my question is like, in reality, when do we need to write a review paper? What's the apt time to write a review paper? Is it something like how far we should go to write a review paper?
Okay, so this is a very special topic. Let me try to. Well, first of all, why do you need a review paper? This is the question that I often ask when some students come to me and say, why don't we just write together a review paper? I have this request even coming from LinkedIn. But okay, why do I need a review paper? Why do you need a review paper? This is the question that I normally ask, because in most cases, people write review papers for themselves. Meaning that, okay, you collected so much like information, why don't I condense it into something that I love myself? Like, I like the way it's written, I like the way I convey the ideas in it. Okay, fine. But you've written it for yourself in the first place. Deep down, it's for yourself in most cases. So that's what I see. I might be wrong, but I normally deeply analyze what's happening, and I see like most students just want to write it as sort of as a way to make sure they feel comfortable about the field. So like they went deep enough that they're able to write a review. But you see, I never mentioned that they writing it for someone else. They just write it, not like for someone. There's a difference. And this comes to now to the point when you have to look at what kind of reviews are available in literature. So we see, as a result, quite a number of different types of reviews. First type is like a review of everything that the authors think is important. And then what kind of audience will you have for that review? Of course, it can be cited later, but it's not about the citations. Few people really care how many reviews students have, to be honest, because we usually care about the scholarship, meaning like what is your scientific input. So you can write 10 reviews, but if you have zero scientific results from yourself, I'm sorry, but it doesn't, I mean, okay, you're just like a literature reviewer, fine, but tomorrow it will be ChatGPT, and like what's the difference now? And they can probably do it faster and better. So this is the problem. So a lot of reviews have very little use for the community. This is unfortunately, at least in the fields that I work in, I see it all the time. Very few reviews are really helpful because they don't go, like they're written to, like in a way, like they cite a very specific type of niche or subfield, or they just go over all kind of research that they don't filter good studies from bad studies. And this is happening all the time. So a lot of reviews just will be gone. They're gone unnoticed in many ways. And there, I think, writing these kind of reviews is just a waste of time, because it takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of mental work to write a review. But if you don't have somebody who's guiding you, so you don't learn how to separate good studies from bad studies, how to ensure that you can make an unbiased picture for your readers, for your audience, an unbiased picture of what is actually happening in the field. So you don't put some because there's so many studies who just like don't really give any scientific they have no scientific meaning, but they're still in the reviews. It's very often the case. So as a result, if you don't go over this learning process, the review is becoming just a burden for you in the end. So you spend that time, and instead you perhaps have less results, your current study is less completed, maybe you haven't started a new project yourself, so your scholarship goes down. So this is one of the problems. There are other types of reviews where people write them specifically for the community. And that's where, at least myself, I like those kind of reviews. Those are typically like opinions. So you use literature to convey your, not just like what literature conveys, because it's so hard to, at least everyone says different things. So how do you really convey? There's no whole picture often in many fields these days. So you use it to explain the trends that are, in your opinion, important. And then of course, you have to justify why it's important. And in those cases, often what helps is when there are few experts in the same review, and they all have a joint opinion that is polished a little bit and less biased as a result. Those types of reviews often are much more valuable. And at least myself, having very little time to read reviews, I tend to read them more often. And there, students can, of course, participate and should, because there's still the background that should be more or less digested well enough, and most PIs have no time to do this. However, what I think is important for students in those cases is to make sure they understand the vision of their professors, of their collaborators in that review, of the experts. They understand the vision and why that vision exists, and how to form that vision, and how to convey it in a paper, in a review. So that experience can be invaluable, because that's the way later you apply for faculties in many countries. You have to provide your vision, you have to explain why it's important and not something else. You have to make sure it's based on existing literature, but not on every single literature, but like on the literature that you think is impactful. And then you have to show, like, where is it going to go in 5 years from now, 10 years from now? This is your sort of research vision, right? And so in some way, I see that transitioning into your own development. And those kind of reviews, I personally like, and I normally advise people, okay, if you have a chance, get involved for sure. So in a nutshell, you want to make sure you spend your time in a way that is valuable to you in the long run. Not today, but in the long run. Because you can write 3 reviews per year easily. Would you prefer to write 3 reviews or 1 very good scientific paper? You have a choice. You can't do both, because then the quality will go down on both ends. So what do you choose? Will it be more valuable to write a review or write a scientific, or do more scientific studies? The time is not infinite when you work as a PhD student. This is something that I think is very important to understand for everyone who just start their PhDs.
Okay, maybe like I would like to touch upon one point that you mentioned related to good study versus bad study. Understanding like whether this is something that I should move forward with this idea, or like when you read to a couple of papers, like how can someone who is very new do this process of demarcating a good study versus bad study?
This is tricky. So you learn slowly, and I wouldn't say like many professors even know exactly how to separate these things. Myself, if I'm not an expert, or I don't know well enough a certain technical approach to experiments. So say there's some microscopy type that I don't know exactly all the details well enough, I might not be able to judge properly on the correctness of the study that involves this microscopy. Now, in most cases, it's still possible because, there are a lot of new things that are introduced these days, but still most of science is based on the existing approaches, existing methods, existing chemistry, physics, characterization, and so on. And models, of course. Modeling is a separate story. So in those cases, there are several ways. First, you keep reading, and the more you read, the more you will learn, and the more you will learn, the more you will see how to perform studies in the best possible way. So you will have a distribution. Okay, this way is better, this way is worse. Just keep reading. Second is, of course, talk to your advisor. So your advisor is your feedback loop. And this this is why I think that advisors should spend as much time as they can with their students, because that feedback loop is what gives you a very quick growth in being able to separate good studies from bad studies. Next is talk to other colleagues whose judgment you trust. Not just everyone, but to others, and discuss the scientific results with them. Go to conferences and your seminars at your university, at your institute. Check what questions people ask. Ask these questions yourself. Are they answered in this manuscript? Are they answered with this technique? Did they calibrate things properly? The model, does it really make sense to use that model instead of the other? You try to engage in this questioning, and that questioning will help you calibrate yourself slowly, and that's how we become scientists. We're slowly growing. It's not like, it's like a flick and then you're perfect. No way, absolutely. It takes years, if not tens of years. And then check papers that come from the top experts. This is one of the biggest advices that I normally give. So you have to know, and there your advisor can be helpful. In general, you can just check like who writes what, and find 10 or 15 experts around the globe who are writing the most sophisticated studies in the field that you work in, and subscribe to their papers, read them, and then that will calibrate the research quality that you should be following. And of course, that will help you tremendously with filtering the right literature, because the amount of literature we have, at least in my field, is like 10 times more than we had 10 years ago. It's just like you can't even penetrate that fog when you have to dig through literature. It's often very difficult. So one of the best ways is just to find the best experts and try to follow them and see if their studies make sense.